Hey, everybody, this is your host, Mark Smith, for the 4C podcast, and I'm here with the team from Step to Compliance, Brian Cromer and Mary Beth Clifford. Welcome, guys.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
So, we're here because of an event that's happening pretty quickly here, which is the final publishing of Quado B and C. And so, I'm super excited actually to get an update from y'all who have taken a look at this. Obviously we've talked off and on as different drafts have come, but this will be a great update. So for those of you who are watching and really wanted to know what's inside, Quado B and C, this is a must-see podcast. So take it away.
Well, before we get started on that, I just want to lay the foundation that the ABCs of Quad O are inseparable from the Inflation Reduction Act and Subpart W. Each one of these three separate pieces of legislation are interrelated and work together. The fee placed on waste emissions is coming from the Inflation Reduction Act. It's targeting those that report their greenhouse gases, and those same people are performing inspections under the ABCs of Quad O. So I just want to keep the focus on how these three rules are working together and why that matters, because inspections that you're going to be doing under A or B of Quad O will support your greenhouse gas reporting, especially those that show no leaks. So I want to be the light tower and not the rocks. There is some basic management practices and things we can look to from the almost 30 years of the EPA STAR program. So I've put this slide in here and put a link because I think the foundation is best management practices. Yes, we've got new rules, but we're going to comply with these and we're going to continue to prosper as an industry. So brief history on this, there's links if you want to follow from the 2012 timeframe of Quad O all the way up until tomorrow when this gets proposed. The link will change. Here's the links to how this legislation came out. It started with Quad O and only focusing on VOCs. Quad OA came out and we had VOCs and methane coming in. And now there's this broader scope which reaches greater number of facilities and will be retroactive to all facilities in time in the B and C of Quad O. So the applicability for this is pretty straightforward. On the left, we've got the key dates that show when your facility can be pulled in. And then, like we said, Quad O started with VOC, Quad OA is VOC and methane, B is VOC and methane, and emissions guideline C, as it promulgates through the states, will be methane only. But there's your decoder ring for it. And Mary Beth, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Awesome. As we mentioned, we're expecting the final publication of Quado B and C and Appendix K in the Federal Register tomorrow, March 8th. And so with that, it kicks off the timeline for compliance. And so now we can actually start to wrap some dates around when things are going to be due and what that compliance timeline is going to look like. As Brian mentioned, you've got your decoder ring for the applicability for Quado B and for emission guideline C. Under NSPS Quado B, because they're publishing final language that's very different in some regards from the original proposed rule text, they have implemented some interim compliance periods for some of those things where they realize that they've made such drastic changes that expecting compliance within 60 days of publication is not realistic. And so, we'll cover a few of those in here so that you can see, but it's also important to note that you have interim standards to achieve during that interim compliance period, but then you also need to know when that interim period is going to end so that you can ensure full compliance with the new standards. And then also look for under the emissions guideline Quado C, states are going to be kicking off a lot of rulemaking here very shortly over the next 2 years to meet their deadline, as that's they have 2 years. They have till March 8th, 2026 to submit their state plans. And this is a really great opportunity as operators of existing sites to make sure that you weigh in because you do have the ability to impact how these final state implementation rules roll out, and you know best the economic and technical feasibility for those existing sources. So don't ignore your opportunity to impact state level rulemaking.
Don't the states just have to accept Quad O, B, and C? I mean, they can't go below it, right? Don't they have to,
Correct.
yeah.
Yeah, they do have to use the model rule for Quad OC, but the actual implementation of how they do that with existing sources is going to look a little bit different. And so EPA is strongly encouraging operators to get involved in this process to help, because it's going to be different in different basins as far as what the technical feasibility is. So,
But it cannot be less stringent
no.
than what's proposed in Quad OB. It can be more stringent.
Yes. So just a few slides that'll be for your reference. You'll be able to access these slides in a PDF. We'll provide a link at the end for you to get them, but we do go through just the differences between Quad O, Quad OA, Quad OB, and Quad OC. And those are just some charts that are to help you be able to break down exactly what's covered and what it looks like under each of those different rules. We're going to dive into the final Quad OB, and this is primarily focused on Quad OB because that's rule text that we know. Quad OC, it's going to be a little bit different across each state, but we can know exactly what's in Quad OB and that timeline of compliance. Well completions has stayed similar to Quad OA, and there were not really any huge changes that came out in the final verbiage. There's just a few things to be aware of as you're doing those well completions with the initial flowback and separation flowback. The goal here being that you find ways to avoid venting during well completions. Liquids unloading is a new thing from Quad OA. It doesn't, and so that's a whole new thing to be documenting and doing record keeping around. There were originally, they wanted zero venting with the liquids unloading. They have changed that in the final verbiage, and so it's more so design a best management practices plan to implement and follow it, and then some pretty stringent record keeping that goes along with showing that you followed that best management practices plan every time you did a liquids unloading if you're not able to do it with zero vent. And then also another new aspect in Quad OB is associated gas from oil wells. And really they outline 4 key ways that they want you to be recovering that. You can either route it to a gas gathering line or collection system, use it as an on-site fuel source, use it for another useful purpose, or re-inject into the well or another well. This is one of those aspects where the final verbiage around this was quite a bit different from the original. And so there is alternative interim compliance around this to allow operators who've already begun construction or completed construction on wells to comply with alternative requirements until they're able to accomplish one of these 4 methods of recovering the associated gas or demonstrating on an annual basis the technical and feasibility for any of those 4 options. And as we come to the end of all of the different requirements around wells, one of the really big changes from Quad OA to Quad OB is the definitions of well site. Well site was pretty basic in Quad OA. Under Quad OB, there's actually 4 different types of definition. And so it's important as you start to wrap your arms around this rule and understanding your applicability and the requirements that you are able to classify each of your well sites based on the definitions provided in the rule. And so this slide will help you be able to put it in the correct bucket for the purposes of some of the other requirements that are in Quad OB.
And that's important for compression and the requirements around compression, because around wellhead, they're exempt from packing measurement, a few things that we'll see.
Yes. So which does bring us, that's a good segue into compressor applicability. We've thrown the applicability timeline here, again, just as a means of helping you understand where it's going to fall into. So any compressor, centrifugal or reciprocating, that's installed after December 6th, 2022 at either a centralized production facility, a compressor station, or a natural gas processing plant will be subject to the requirements of Quad OB. Compressors located at all well site definitions, regardless of what the well site definition is, are exempt from compressor requirements under Quad OB. So
Does that include the pneumatics, or is that just the packing?
Just the packing vent for the compressor. Yes. So with this, the requirements around centrifugal compressors, they've brought in dry seal to the final verbiage on all of this. And you can see there that they provide an annual flow rate maximum. And so you'll be doing an annual flow rate measurement on those. Similarly with the wet seal, they've brought in a couple of different options to either reduce your VOC emissions by 95%, or you can also do a flow rate measurement not to exceed 3 scuff per minute per seal. And then similarly with reciprocating compressors, some big differences between the Quad OA, where you replaced it every 3 years or every 26,000 hours with your rod packing, to now you are either going to take an annual flow rate measurement to establish that you are leaking below 2 scuff per minute per rod packing, or you can route those emissions to a process or a control device and avoid doing the flow rate measurement. So in this, coming into fugitive emissions monitoring, which is facility-wide, this is where knowing your definition of the facility is critical, because as you can see, some differences between Quad O, Quad OA, into the Quad OB and C, that definition of a well site really impacts your frequency. This pretty much is going final as it was proposed. There really weren't any substantive changes to this section as far as the monitoring requirements for AVO and OGI. This table and the requirements have stayed the same. Appendix K is a new OGI protocol specifically for gas processing plants. Previously, under different rules for gas processing plants, the method of monitoring has been method 21, a very manual, time-consuming, costly, and even dangerous process for monitoring. They've switched to OGI as a monitoring protocol, but there are different standards around how that is to be conducted at a gas processing plant. Definitely a lot more stringent in how that needs to be accomplished and the requirements around the monitoring plan for that. But
correct me if I'm wrong. Even if you use OGI at a gas plant and follow Appendix K, you're still obliged to do an annual method 21, correct? Or you can do exclusive OGI.
You can do exclusive OGI. It's a bi-monthly frequency to do OGI only. And they will also, if you're following Quad OB, there's some verbiage in there that you could, if you're doing a Quad OB OGI Appendix K level inspection, you can count that as fulfillment of your Quad OA. If you're under Quad OA, there is what's called the alternative work practice, which allows you to do OGI monitoring with that annual method 21 that you're referring to. I think one of the awesome new features in this is the advanced methane measurement program that they're bringing out, that's allowing for the advancement of a lot of new technologies that have been innovating over the last few years. They have made some changes to the final detection thresholds and how that's going to look, as well as to the process for submitting for approval under the advanced methane measurement program. It is important to note that even though they have implemented a 2-year interim on this advanced methane measurement program, you still cannot use an advanced technology in place of your actual OGI monitoring until that advanced technology has been approved by the EPA. So I know a lot of technologies are in the process of putting together those applications and getting them ready to submit to EPA. EPA has said that their portal for accepting those applications will be open on May 7th, and they are holding a webinar on April 15th to go over what they want to see in those applications. And it's a quite extensive webinar. I believe it's like 3 hours long. So we're gonna start to see the benefit of some of these pilot programs and new technologies that have been coming out and be able to leverage those to meet our requirements for our methane management. And then this is probably the most controversial one in the rule. This is actually promulgating through Quad O, Quad OA, Quad OB, and Quad OC. The final rule verbiage pulled this in to the amendments of Quad O and Quad OA. So it's no longer just in Quad OB and C, and that's the super emitter events, defined as a quantified emission rate of greater than 100 kilograms per hour of methane. They have wrapped some requirements around how third parties can participate in this program, and everything will be handled and managed through the EPA. So third parties will take their information to the EPA. EPA will review it, and then if they validate the data, it will then be posted to the EPA's super emitter program website and provided to the operator to respond to.
And you have pictured here a press release that went out on something that launched this week that you might want to dive into.
Yes, so that's no coincidence that this week, the week that Quad O, B, and C are being published in the Federal Register, that methane sat also was deployed and achieved orbit just yesterday. And so they're expecting to start seeing data coming in from methane sat here in the next few weeks as well, part of a global methane monitoring initiative.
And
So
although, yeah, go ahead,
it looks
Mark.
like from the picture, they're saying, hey, we can detect large emissions, i.e. super emitters, from individual sources. And so their implication is not only saying, hey, we found 100 kilogram or more methane leak on this site, but it actually came from, let's say, an unlit flare or something like that. If that's the case, that will open up a whole new level of, you know.
Yeah, I'm not sure how they're defining source. It was not clear from the press release whether a source to them is a facility versus an area of facilities or a basin. But yeah, that would be pretty incredible.
Well, I don't think that the detection technologies are greater than that 100 kilogram per hour. I think almost in every case to find the exact source. I mean, these satellites will trigger boots on the ground. The next slide has a satellite program that's existed a little bit longer under the United Nations, which is the whole reason we have these obligations under Quad O, A and B, and ultimately C. The concern of methane comes from our involvement in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there is this International Methane Emissions Observatory and the Methane Alert and Response System that also has the capacity to feed into super emitter. But I will say this, even though we're not talking about subpart W, these satellites will also be able to see what is classified as large release events, or even if it was a slow leak, but it amassed 250 metric tons or more, the satellites are going to be able to pick up on that. So it's a double whammy. Not only will the super emitter be here in Quad OB, but there are these large release events that could be picked up on the satellites that fall under, let's say, your greenhouse gas reporting and not necessarily Quad OB or A.
So, and this is going to bring us into our pneumatic requirements that Brian mentioned earlier as far as applicability goes. So it doesn't matter what facility type, whether it's well site, compressor station, centralized production facility, the new standard under Quad OB and under Quad OC will be 0 methane and VOC emissions. And they've finalized the verbiage around this that specifically for controllers, natural gas driven process controllers or pneumatics, that it must be routed to a process. They are not deeming that routing to a control device is truly 0 emissions, because there are some emissions that come from the control devices, because the standard around control devices is a 95% reduction of fugitives. So they truly want 0 emissions, and the only way to achieve that is to either go to something not gas driven, or to route those emissions to a process.
So a flare under this definition is considered a control, and because a flare could not be lit, that's not a process. So whereas when we were talking about the packing vent on the compressor, it could be routed to control or process, the pneumatics can only be routed to process, as Mary Beth has pointed out here.
Yes, and that's a big change and adjustment. And again, this is one of those areas where we're going to see some interim compliance, so that operators have an opportunity to bring existing controllers into compliance. It was just going to be a little too stressful to try and get those into compliance within 60 days. So they're providing an additional year to bring pneumatic controllers to that 0 emission standard.
And one last comment on the pneumatic controllers. It does not mean they can't run off process gas, or that they must be retrofitted to something like electric, or that they must be 0 vent. So it's not forcing you necessarily to remove or change those controls, but to address how they vent. So I've heard some people say that it has to be electric, or it has to be process, has to be compressed air or nitrogen, and not, but you can run them on process gas, you just can't vent.
Another one that finished is going final, different from what was expected, are storage tanks, storage vessels. Similar to the original proposed text, one of the big changes from Quad OA to Quad OB is that when you calculate your potential emissions, it needs to be cumulative to the battery and not based on individual tanks. So your applicability is based on your potential cumulative VOC emissions and your potential cumulative methane emissions. And whereas in Quad OA, you only did your potential to emit on VOCs, in Quad OB, you're going to calculate your potential to emit for both VOC and methane emissions. There's 2 different thresholds. It's important to note that if you trigger either VOC or methane, you are applicable to these standards. It's not you trigger both. If you trigger VOC, you're pulled in. If you trigger methane, you're pulled in to these requirements. And it's also a once in, always in. There's no off ramp for a facility that has triggered these, should their emissions fall below the potential to emit thresholds. Also, a tricky part of this is some verbiage around when must I comply with these requirements. And if it's read plainly, really and truly, the potential to emit calculation needs to be done within 30 days of publication in the Federal Register, which means that that potential to emit calculation on your storage tank and your storage battery or your tank batteries needs to be done by April 7th. And then you need to have your controls in place and compliance in place by May 7th. So that one's a little bit tricky as far as how that compliance timeline rolls out.
And with the exception of, let's say, Colorado, most of these tanks have been assessed for VOCs and criteria pollutants, but might be permitted for that, but not GHGs. So the methane assessment in the majority of cases has not been done. That PTE is going to need to be completed.
Correct. There's a lot of new verbiage around control devices. So it's really critical that you evaluate what control devices you are using and whether they meet the standards of Quad OB or not. It's way too much to try and get into in a single overview. So just be aware that there's some pretty significant changes around the requirements for control devices. As we mentioned, there's interim compliance requirements. What we've done is we've outlined them for you here as to which equipment or processes have an interim compliance and where you can find those compliance requirements and when that interim time period ends. And then there's also a lot of different definitions of modification and reconstruction throughout this rule based on different components or equipment and processes. So we've outlined for you what those things are, like how you would trigger modification of your pneumatic controllers or reconstruction. Similarly with like your storage vessels or your tank batteries.
So is the big idea that you have a site that was overall built, let's say before December 6th, 2022. So it's a Quad OC site, okay? Mm-hmm. Now you switch out, you added, let's say you had 4 tanks in your battery, and now you add 4 more, okay? So you've triggered the 50% thing. Does now the whole entire site just fall into Quad OB?
Yes. So, and that's where it gets a little bit tricky because, so with pneumatic controllers, if you increase your pneumatic controllers by even 1 gas-driven controller at that site, all of your controllers at that site become affected by Quad OB. So now you must deal with all of them. Similar with pumps. Storage vessels, this is where understanding the difference between modification and reconstruction is important. Modification, if you add 1 vessel or you increase your throughput or you increase your cumulative storage, if you swap a vessel and you put it in a larger vessel, that triggers modification. Your reconstruction is triggered when you replace 50% or more of the vessels that are there. The interesting one is with compressor stations. So if you swap a compressor with a like kind that is the same or smaller horsepower, you're not increasing the horsepower at that compressor station, that compressor will be Quad OB applicable because it was set after December 6th, 2022, but it does not make the entire compressor station Quad OB applicable. So like your fugitive monitoring is not going to be impacted by a compressor swap with a like kind. If you increase your horsepower or you add a compressor, then yes, the whole compressor station is affected. So some tricky nuances in some of these.
And I mean, a lot of the rules for C and B are the same, but the one main thing that might go if you move a C facility into a B facility is C's are methane only and B's are VOC. So with that is
B is VOC and methane.
Methane. Yeah.
So whereas C is methane only.
Correct. Yep. So and then that brings us to, all of these new things are going to have initial and annual reporting. That initial report is going to be due August 4th, 2025. EPA is currently working on a reporting template for that. I expect that we'll see it at some point late this year or early next year so that we can work on that. I would just encourage, don't be shy in your record keeping. Make sure that you've got good records so that when it comes to reporting time, you actually have the data that you need, regardless of what they ask for in that template. We've given you some of the key definitions that we reference here that are important to how you interpret things in this rule. And then because we've thrown so much content at you so quickly, if you want access to today's slide deck, there's a QR code here that you can hit, and that will allow you to access the slide deck. With that, you're also going to receive some additional resources to our Subpart W proposed amendments summary. And then we've also created a red line document of Subpart W that helps you see the differences between the current Subpart W and what it'll look like after the proposed amendments are implemented. And then this will also get you signed up to receive periodic regulatory updates from us to keep you in the know as things continue to roll out over the next few years.
Excellent.
Yeah, this combined with the new SEC reporting rules we expect to drop from the BLM, everything is looking very Eldar-esque, right? We have to leak less, we have to be leak aware. I mean, that is the future we are facing.
Excellent. Well, hey, wherever this publishes, we will include whatever links we need to get that additional resources. So, since this is part of the 4C thing, let's wrap up with this. So 4C is coming up. What is Step to Compliance going to be talking about at 4C, and what should they expect if they visit you at your booth?
Man, well, they can see how we manage methane intensity in near time and manage LDAR, both voluntary, regulatory, state, federal. And we'll be doing 3 separate training sessions, 2 on Tuesday related to methane intensity, and 1 on how digital transformation and managing your assets on Friday. Mary Beth, you've got 2 speaking spots as well you might want to speak about.
I'll actually be doing a little bit more of a deep dive into the history of fugitives monitoring, going through that whole history and where we're at now and what that's looking like in the future. Then I'm also doing one on the importance of record keeping and reporting with all of these new changes that are coming out.
Excellent. Well, what a fantastic update. I appreciate it. The Step to Compliance team for being here. And anyway, we look forward to all the show notes, the follow-up information, and seeing you guys at 4C.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark.